Good evening all, and welcome. Tonight we're going to be hitting some Let's Not Meet stories. Some of these might get quite explicit, so you have been forewarned that they're going to get dark. I'd also like to extend a huge thank you to everyone who has contributed or is thinking about contributing to the funding of the Mort's Bedtime Stories app, an app where you can listen to all my stories ad-free. We're trying to get it off the ground, and we have already hit nearly 30% of the funding we needed to just fine-tune it and get it ready and perfect for everyone. So if you'd like to donate, link in the description. You get rewards for doing so, don't worry. But for now, it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. When living in a major metropolitan city, you never know what walks of life you will pass or drop off. So a little backstory. In 2003, I was a 16-year-old employee at an urban clothing store here on the south side of Chicago. At the time, I had a manager who was in his early 20s by the name of Anthony. Anthony was pretty arrogant and obnoxious, but overall he was a pretty cool guy. I used to kind of give him crap and tease him when it came to approaching the ladies, because he always seemed too timid or too aggressive. I was and still am a ladies' man, so yeah, I was being an arse. After working at this place for about 3 months, Anthony asks me if I drop him off at his home. It wasn't far from the direction I was heading in, so I dropped him off maybe twice a week for the next month. Now let me tell you, these car rides were uncomfortable. This guy, as much as we spoke at work, would not speak and sort of just kept looking straight. It got to the point that his awkwardness went from entertaining, as I was 16. Most awkward people are interesting to teenagers, to straight creepy. Fast forward 3 years later. I'm watching the news as they go into horrific details of a crime committed by a Comcast installation worker. Apparently, the Comcast worker entered 2 homes he was due for an installation, raped, beat, and strangled 2 women. The real unfortunate thing is this happened on 2 different occasions, and after the first murder the gentleman was arrested and questioned, but released and was sent back to work, which allowed him to strike again. As the picture of his mugshot flashed on the screen, I froze. It was Anthony. Now, growing up on the south side of Chicago, I have grown up and befriended a fair share of people who grew up to be murderers, but this took the cake. So Anthony Triplet, let's not meet, because that would only mean I'd be in jail with you. This incident happened in the summer of 2015. I lived by myself in a nice house in a small town. Low crime, but still the occasional shady person. Anyway, at work one day on a smoke break, I watched a dog get thrown from a moving vehicle. 4-lane city traffic during the start of rush hour. I ran out of there, scooped him up and booked it back to my workplace. He was miraculously not injured. As a bleeding heart animal lover, I decided to take him home with me, until I could figure out what to do with him. I have a large amount of cats, and always have done. This was my first experience with a dog that I was solely responsible for. This guy was very shy, head hung, tail tucked, jumpy, just looking at me like I was about to beat him. I was clueless on the subject of dog personalities and tendencies. I just knew that they needed to be taken out frequently. His first night with me, we had been out about 15 times, as I did not want him pooing in my house. I was having my final cigarette of the day on my porch around 10:30. The dog was on a lead, chilling under my chair as I smoked and poked about on Reddit, when I see a man walking on the sidewalk that runs by my house. He keeps glancing up at me before passing. Shortly after he passes my house, he stopped, turned on his heels and approached. "Hey, can you tell me where 302 Church Street is?" I'd told him I'd searched the address on my phone, which of course was taking a minute to pop up. He explained he didn't have a phone of his own and was attempting to get to a friend's house, taking small steps towards me the whole time. Finally, the address I summoned came up. "It's exactly 2 blocks north of here, right on the southwest corner and across the street," I told him. pointing in the direction. He kept his eyes locked on me, continuing to slowly move closer. That's when the dog starts growling very softly at that point. I'd almost forgotten he was there. "Mind if I look at that map?" He grinned sheepishly. "Bad with directions, you know." I rose from my seat, pointing again. "It's truly just 2 blocks up the road. Just follow it. 2 blocks. The house will be on your left," making it very clear I wasn't going to hand him my phone. "Well, could I call him? Need to let him know I'm coming, ain't I?" he said, creeping closer still, extending his hand. "No." "How about text him?" "Dude, no." Start making my way towards my door. Just let me see your phone." He was visibly becoming pissed off, clearly trying to contain it and getting way too close to my porch. As a last-ditch effort of getting this dude to leave, I say, "You need to get off my yard. My dog is protective, and he'll mess you up." Hell, I didn't know anything about this dog, let alone whether he had the capability to mess someone up. I just hoped saying it would intimidate the guy. Like I had said the magic word, the pup sprang into action. Like a la the wolf creature, from the never-ending story he emerges like a bullet from under the chair, growling, snarling, and barking his little butt off. He jerks me, damn near off the porch, trying to get this guy. He sounded and acted like an 80-pound dog, not a 40-pound timid beagle mix. I was afraid. I didn't know if the pup would turn on me. As stated previously, at the time I knew absolutely nothing about dogs. He backed his hindquarters into my legs, almost nudging me to the door, still carrying on, eyes locked on the dude and baring his teeth. The dude held up his hands and backed off, stammered something like, 2 blocks north, yeah?" and began walking that way. I go in, cut my lights off and peek out the window. He glances at the house. Assured I'm inside, he turns and begins to walk in a completely opposite direction. Icing on the cake, he pulls out a phone from his pocket, raises it to his ear, and makes a call. The dog secured his place as a member of my family that night. He is incredibly protective of me, and has frightened away another creeper since this incident. He is attached to my hip, and has made it known that he is grateful to be in a safe and loving home, wherein he will never be again a projectile from a moving vehicle. His name is Hank, and I truly believe that night would have ended very poorly for me had he not been there. I like to do work around homes in my spare time. I found a guy in the gigs section who was doing some renovations on a duplex and was looking for an extra hand. He knew electrical. I was good with carpentry. Perfect. Pick up some extra cash and skills working a few nights. We send a few texts and he stops over to meet me. Nice enough guy, and we planned to get started. I would usually take the bus around the city, but my mum and sister were in town, so they gave me a lift. "Don't end up locked in a basement," my sister jokes, as I hop out. He offers a beer while he breaks down the project, and from what I can tell, he's doing a nice job. We talk about the work in general for a bit, and kick back with another beer, maybe 2. Time's passing, and he's supposed to be paying me for my time, so I find it a little odd. But heck, it's how I would work on my house too, so power to you. Beers are cold, keep 'em coming. After 4 or 5, we finally get moving and do a few odd jobs that take all of half hour, and he's debating how far he wants to take it tonight. We have a beer while we think about it. "I'm thinking of calling it a night. Another beer and a cigarette? I'll show you the rest of what I've been working on," he says. Works for me, as I follow him up from the table. I've lost count of how many India Pale Ale beers I've put back at this point, but my vision says I'm in the 10 to 12 range. He holds open the door and tells me to head down in front of him into the basement. Not until this very moment have I thought twice about the course of the night, but that one word brought it all rushing back into perspective. I'm on high alert, but he hasn't done anything egregious, so I finish the cigarette and pray that I don't take a wrench to the head on my way back up. Safe back at the table. "So, do you miss your girlfriend?" "Yeah, she's in Jersey, so it's tough seeing her." "Do you miss her sexually?" "The heck, man." Bells are ringing. It's 1 in the morning. He changes the subject, but the mood has shifted. Sensing this, he decides to go for broke. What follows is a stream of things that shall not be repeated, beginning with an innuendo and easing not so gracefully into the explicit. I am legitimately afraid now when my brain is firing. 1, don't freak him out. At least I'm bigger. 2, who the hell does this? 3, do I really have nice legs? 4, I hope that there wasn't anything in those drinks. 5, if he pays me now, is this considered prostitution? You got the wrong sort of Craigslist section, buddy, is what I came out with in the end. He actually paid me, and I ran the 4 miles home, stopping only for Chinese food for some reason. I was drunk, had money to burn, and figured this decision couldn't be much worse than the last. In the summer of 2015, I was 33 years old, broke, and jobless in Mexico City. My entire life had gone steadily down the drain for the past few years, and my best friend had moved back to Europe. I was tired and bored, so when an online friend I had met in person 2 years before invited me to spend a month in his farmhouse in Norway, I accepted without hesitation. The deal was simple. In exchange for some work at the farm, I would get some pretty sweet holidays in a country I had always wanted to visit. I have no problem doing labor work. In fact, I was always looking forward to do it and to get my body into real action. Since I had moved back to Mexico City from Canada in 2011, I had been feeling rusted and soft, so I packed my suitcase, put on my boots, and said goodbye to Mexico City the best way I knew how, by getting absolutely pissed drunk. I arrived to Stavanger in Norway, but my suitcase decided to go to Thailand instead. I think it got the better deal. So after an hour filling the reports in and giving the address of my friend's house, I was able to walk out and meet him again. My friend Harold was standing there, confused and annoyed. He told me later he was about to leave the airport thinking I had decided to not take the flight after all. Guess I was lucky. That night, I spent it with Harold and his friends in an oceanfront apartment in a quiet neighborhood in Stavanger, getting drunk on Norwegian beer and smoking weed. The next day, Harold drove me all the way to his farmhouse about an hour south of Stavanger, in a community called Ergesund. At least, that's what I think it was called. Norwegian names and addresses were weird if you're not familiar with them. The land Harold owned was huge and beautiful. Not really sure how it all works, but in his property there's a lighthouse that attracts a lot of tourists from all over Europe. The house itself was located on top of a small hill, with a huge barn next to it. Harold lived alone, in the 2-story house, but I was told the basement housed a tenant. As soon as I glanced the basement window, I got a strange feeling of dread. There was a webcam facing the driveway, and the rest of the window was covered by boxes and papers, but I decided not to mention it to Harold, since he didn't seem to care. I just assumed the guy was an eccentric man, or maybe a normal precaution considering we were more or less in the middle of nowhere, with no neighboring houses, just separated by big fields. I took my mind off things and focused on the joy of being in Norway. After being installed in one of the bedrooms upstairs, I was informed that that week, Harold's son's wedding was going to be celebrated, and thus the house would need to be filled with the bride's family from Bergen. I think, anyway. In general, it was great to meet them, but on my second night when everyone had gone to sleep, and Harold and I were still up chatting and drinking beer, I got to meet the tenant, Olaf. Harold had been having some trouble with his new smartphone, and apparently Olaf was tech-savvy, and had indeed been the one purchasing the phone for Harold. We went downstairs to his basement. Now Harold kept telling me that he didn't like Olaf and was actually upset by the way Olaf kept the newly remodeled basement. But from what I understood, they had some kind of relationship more than just landlord and tenant. The basement was dark, all the windows covered, and piles of junk cluttered the entire place. The bedroom was full of computer parts and electronic junk. He had blinking and beeping things everywhere, and he invited us to sit down. And when he turned on a desk lamp to check Harold's phone, I got the first real good look of him. He was in his mid-40s but looked older. Shaved head, really skinny, big nose and deep shadows under his eyes. He had the entire look of a meth addict. I should know, since I worked in a recovery house in Surrey, British Columbia, Canada. I had seen the same face back then in the people who were dealing with severe addictions. The way he stuttered only confirmed further my observations, and I decided that I had to keep an eye on him. My gut told me right then and there he was trouble. Olaf finished with Harold's phone and then directed his attention to me and asked me if I would like to see some porn, to which I declined entirely. I just wanted to leave the dark and oppressive basement. Harold laughed a drunken laughter and asked Olaf if he had gay porn, to which Olaf said he didn't care about the sexuality of the videos. He simply liked to see people getting things introduced to them. When he said that, I got chills running down my spine, and I asked myself if he meant in a sexual way or if there was a more ominous meaning to it. But we didn't stay to find out. Harold had a busy day, and the next day I was tired and thoroughly creeped out by him. When we were back in the house, I asked Harold if he trusted his friend, to which he replied that Olaf wasn't his friend. He was just an addict renting the basement. The government paid Harold to rent, and a nurse visited him twice a week to bring him his medication. After dropping that bomb, he said goodnight and went to his bedroom. I tried not to think about Olaf, but between my gut feeling and him popping into the house unannounced when everyone else was preparing for the wedding that weekend, I couldn't really relax. The first time he went inside was to give me a flash drive with movies he had downloaded for me from the internet. He made sure to emphasize that it was illegal. The second time, he seemed high and wanted to simply let me know that if I needed anything I could ask him, but asked me to not tell Harold about him going up. He said that and then walked out very slowly and carefully, as if he knew he would fall if he rushed. When the wedding was over and the house was again empty, except for Harold and I, the encounters with Olaf became stranger and more often. One time while I was in the kitchen fixing myself some breakfast, I turned around to find Olaf standing on the kitchen door, bleeding from his nose, staring at me. I jumped out of my skin and dropped my breakfast, creating a huge mess, but he didn't seem to notice and simply started babbling incoherently while directing his cloudy eyes to the ceiling on top of my head. I was petrified, trying to think of a train of actions that wouldn't trigger a violent response from him. He simply turned around and quietly walked out of the house. I started locking the door whenever I was alone in the house since that day. When I told Harold about it, he got visibly mad and went downstairs to talk and yell to Olaf. Harold told me he didn't like to have him in the basement, and he had tried to kick him out several times, but the government had always ruled against evicting him. And Harold's sister was mostly responsible for it. She felt bad for the guy and was 100% on Olaf's side just because he had the same number as her father. Go figure. So Harold had to learn to live with him in the basement, but only because Olaf was supposed to clean and in treatment for his addiction. After that day, Olaf stopped being friendly with me and just became a cold, impassive presence in my life there. There was one day when I was in the barn chatting with a couple of Harold's friends when Olaf entered the barn to place his laptop and some homemade-looking gadget on the window. Despite no one asking, he began to explain to everyone that he was using it to hack into people's networks to get their Wi-Fi password. You know, like everyone does, right? He gave me a nasty glare, and then I stormed out. I turned to Harold's friends and told them I was completely afraid of him, and I had this feeling that he would attack me one day. Harold's friends told me that it would never happen, but that if I felt I was in real danger, I could give them a call and they would pick me up. We exchanged numbers, hugged, and said goodbye for the night. The next day, things between Harold and me turned sour, mostly because I wasn't feeling safe anymore, and I had expressed my wish to instead go to Germany to visit the man who was now my husband. Apparently, Harold had hoped for us to go closer, but he had failed to let me know. In the end, I was exhausted, and I didn't want to deal with that anymore. I should mention that Harold has a severe alcohol problem that I wasn't aware of until the month I spent with him, seeing him get absolutely wasted on a daily basis. To some that might be attractive, but not me. So altogether the situation went from bad to worse, and I wanted out. I'd done my job, I'd done nothing wrong, and I wanted to be able to relax away from both of them. The night I decided to organize my flight to Germany from Norway, Harold went out to get drunk and didn't come back until the early hours of the morning the next day. I had tried to stay up and wait for him to talk, but I must have fallen asleep at some point. I woke up to the sound of the front door being closed, and I caught a glance of him walking towards the barn with the dog and a six-pack of beers through the living room window. I then tried to send him a message through Facebook, but soon discovered the internet was down. That's weird, I thought. In the whole time I had been there, the internet never failed, not even once. I went to the router and restarted it a few times to no avail, and decided to just let it be. Perhaps Harold had cut the internet as a way of a drunken, childish punishment. So I would just get on my morning routine and have breakfast before going to knock on the barn door. That would give him some time to blow off some steam, I thought. I went downstairs to the bathroom, got comfortably naked and jumped into the shower ready to refresh myself and sing a few songs to lift my spirits in preparation for the grim talk that awaited me with Harold. Halfway through the first song, I heard a loud bang coming from the front door, followed by someone screaming my name. I thought Harold must be very drunk and angry. I sighed while turning off the shower, thinking I was going to have a long argument, when the bathroom door slammed open. And that is when I saw, to my horror, Olaf coming at me with a completely deranged expression on his face, wielding a big cutter knife, the kind employees use in warehouses to open boxes. For a few seconds I didn't think or focus on anything other than the knife in his hand, and the fact that I was naked, wet, and cornered in a small bathroom in the middle of nowhere in Norway. I was paralyzed. My biggest fear was actually happening. I couldn't scream or move, I just stared at the knife. He kept pulling and pushing, making that now horrifying noise those blades do while operated. I was about to pass out when Olaf's screams brought me back to the gravity of the situation. He was yelling me, accusing me of playing Harold's feelings. He was calling me a liar, a filthy Mexican, and throwing in some threats about cutting me open and messing with me if I ever tried to take anything from Harold. That, I think, is what got my gears moving again. He called me a thief. I can be whatever, but I'm no thief and I'm not a liar. So standing there getting myself angry at the psycho in front of me threatening my life, my training from the recovery house in Canada kicked in. I remembered the rules from when dealing with altered addicts. Make eye contact, keep your hands down so that you don't startle them, and speak to them in a calm but dominant voice, and always, always, always refer to them by their name. And that is exactly what I did. Despite the fear and certainty of me being stabbed to death, I stared at him in his cloudy, crazy wide eyes and said, "Olaf, you are the thief. You're the one who keeps stealing Harold's silverware. Olaf, you are the one who keeps breaking into the house. Olaf, Harold is not your friend. Harold doesn't even want you living here." It was a long shot, but it worked. My words made him confused, and I was able to take one single small step forward while making him take one small step back. Then he charged at me again with his rant, wielding the knife to my chest and neck. I could feel the cold sweat dripping on my back, and a burning void forming in my stomach every time he launched the knife forward. But I didn't flinch. I stood my ground and kept repeating the same words to him, every time gaining another step, pushing him little by little out of the bathroom. He might have noticed what I was doing, but by then it was too late. When he took the last steps out of the bathroom door frame, I moved as fast as my terrorized body would allow me to, slammed the door on his stupid, crooked nose and locked it, and immediately pushed against it with all my body while a storm of curses, punches and kicks rained on the little farmhouse door. I remember praying to a God I didn't really believe to hold the door in place and to keep the addict out. There was nothing that I could use in the bathroom to defend myself, nothing against an infuriated high psychopath wielding a knife and a possibly broken nose. After what seemed to have been an eternity, I felt, at long last, a very strong kick to the door, and then to my relief he stormed out of the house, with a loud bang of the front door announcing his exit. However, I stayed put for another 20 minutes, not able to breathe or think anything else than keeping the door closed. I wanted to puke, but I couldn't move. Eventually my senses came back, and I knew I had to act quickly. I opened the door to the bathroom, flew upstairs, got dressed, and then exited the house through the window to the garden. I knew he could hear me moving on the first floor, and he had his stupid camera spying on the driveway. I jumped to the garden, jumped the fence, and ran around the house to the barn. I kicked and banged and screamed for Harold to let me in, but it was useless. He was living his drama, and I needed help. So I ran all the way to the next house where his sister lived, rang the bell, and when she opened I explained to her as best I could what happened. She didn't speak a word of English, so it was a comical exchange for about 10 minutes, until her expression shifted from confusion to absolute terror mirroring my own. She walked me up to the barn, opened the door, commanded Harold to guard me, and went straight to the basement to confront Olaf. I was shocked and shaking, still trying to explain to Harold what had just happened. His drunken state was gone by the time I was done. He too went to the basement, and I could hear the screams. They took him out. The sister and her husband got Olaf in the car and took him away. Harold stayed with me all day. I drank so much beer but didn't get drunk, even though I wanted to. I wanted to forget but simply couldn't. I was told that Olaf admitted to having the knife, and that his intentions were to make me fight him. So in reality, he wanted an excuse to stab the Jesus out of my naked butt. After all, he liked to see people have things introduced to them, right? That night, I slept in the house while Harold kept guard of the house. I had some tools with me to defend myself, and of course I slept fully dressed. A horrible night. The next morning we went to the police to file a report, but even the cops seemed baffled and couldn't believe that something like that could ever happen in their small, peaceful, picture-perfect community. But they believed me, and the cop who took my statement asked me if there was somewhere I could go while they sorted out all this mess with Olaf. I told them that I was planning to visit Germany the very next day. That last day I barely spoke with Harold. I didn't blame him, but he told me that in his drunken state, he had told Olaf that I was leaving, and he was sad about it. Since Olaf had been doing drugs all night, he understood that he had to defend Harold. So Olaf cut off the internet, waited for me to go into the shower, and went upstairs to do his job. I left Norway without a single word and without looking back. They told me I could testify via Skype whenever the trial started, so they took my information down and promised justice would be served. It's been more than a year now, and I've never heard a squeak from the police. When I asked Harold about it, he told me the police dropped the case for lack of evidence, and that Olaf is back in Harold's basement doing whatever it is he does. Life goes on, and I was angry for a while, but even anger goes away if there's nothing to burn. I tried to focus on the good things in life and life itself. Every day is a gift or a chance, but the shadow of fear never really left me. I keep looking over my shoulder, keep studying people in case I have to defend myself, and I still have a sense of dread whenever I take a shower, especially at the gym where I'm most vulnerable. I can't help thinking that anyone else would have ended up with a bloated corpse in a pool of blood in that shower, unnoticed for hours and hours, maybe days, until someone had to use that bathroom. If I had done something differently, if Olaf hadn't been so high to be intimidated by my words, that bloated corpse would have been me. I still don't know how to get rid of the thought. But all I know is that Olaf is free, and I really, really, really don't ever want to meet him again. I was in my late teens when Jeff first stumbled into my life in earnest. I was working in a cushy mall in a suburb northwest of Chicago at Hot Topic. If this suburb was my natural habitat, the place where I had grown up, then Hot Topic was my environmental niche within that larger habitat. I was still in the early stages of an eating disorder, the stage where people still complimented me on my figure and exclaimed things like, "Oh, I wish I could be as skinny as you." It suffice to say that I was rolling with various assorted insecurities. I wouldn't realize until much later that I radiated the sort of insecurity that acts as catnip to people with bad intentions. I suspect this is what drew Jeff to me in the first place. As one might expect for a store that specializes in selling goods to angsty suburban teens, shoplifting was a problem. So I was in loss prevention mode when I first glimpsed Jeff, glancing nervously in my direction from behind a display of MLP miscellany. He behaved like a shoplifter, minimizing his body as if to hide, nervously monitoring my attention, lingering far too long at the display without making a selection. Classic shoplifting tells. So, acting like the adult that I desperately wanted to be, I walked over to him and asked if I could help him with anything. He looked as if he was going to crawl out of his skin to escape. He then managed to stammer out I'm just looking, before booking a hasty retreat out of the store. I congratulated myself on a job well done and went back to my duties, thinking that it had been the end of it. I did note that Jeff looked familiar, gaunt, pale, long stringy hair and dressed in clothes so large that it was difficult to ascertain his body type. He was not the sort of person one would forget crossing paths with. However, I wasn't certain where I first encountered him. I didn't devote much effort to solving the mystery. I finished out my workday and went home. Thoughts of the strange encounter evaporated almost instantly after punching out, but several days later Jeff returned. This time he didn't content himself with lurking behind the displays. Instead, he slided up to the counter and began to vomit a thick stream of words in my direction. Jeff told me that he had spotted me around school before he graduated, and I looked cool, like someone he'd like to get to know. He moved around a lot, which made it hard to make friends, and everyone at our school hated him and tried to make his life miserable despite the fact he's a nice guy who's really into vampires, even though all the people at school liked Twilight, but not him, because he knew that Bella was the only scream vampire worth anyone's time. He spoke in one long, never-ending run-on sentence. In fact, I was more of a captivated audience for a monologue than a participant in any conversation. Everything about this was strange, but I chastised myself for being judgmental. The poor guy just said everyone hated him. I thought the least I could do was reserve my judgment and show perhaps a little compassion. I tried to make small talk with him, asking him where he had lived and for how long. His answers were ordinary enough. Still, his behavior triggered a silent alarm within me. Despite myself, I couldn't help but physically back away from him. I noticed Jeff. He didn't care. This disregard for my comfort would become a pattern throughout our many uncomfortable interactions. Over the course of a few months, Jeff became a regular. He seemed to appear every day that I worked. Sometimes he would make a purchase, sometimes he would come and just stand at the counter talking to me, or following me around the crowded store on days that I worked floor. Stopping to chit-chat with employees wasn't particularly unusual. There were several customers who would step in for a chat a few minutes with other employees, and then go about their day. What was unusual was the frequency and duration of Jeff's visits. He would stay for hours at a time when I had to cash out customers, also known as doing the job that I was being paid for. He seemed agitated. He would step to the side, allowing the customer to approach the register, then fold his arms across his chest and tap his foot, silently urging me to speed up the transaction. Then once the transaction was complete, he would step straight back to the counter and continue on without missing a beat. I also found the content of our conversation disturbing. As time passed, he shared increasingly personal information with me. He frequently told me how his mother and his psychologist were attempting to make him appear crazy, and they were forcing him to take medication. He told me that he hoped something terrible would happen to them, like a terrible wasting illness. Indeed, Jeff's favorite topics of discussion were the people that had wronged him and the horrible fate that he hoped would befall them. I recognized this was not appropriate, but truth be told, I was afraid to ask him to leave. I sensed that he was the sort of person who would become dangerous, and it just seemed easier and safer to listen to his rants than to tell him he had to leave the store. One day Jeff was particularly loud, and this prompted my manager to tell him to leave. Once he was gone, my manager gave me a talking to about having my friends visit me at work. I quickly explained that I didn't know Jeff personally. He and I were definitely not friends, and I recounted the increasingly bizarre personal stories he subjected me to, and I expressed that I always felt uncomfortable and unsafe when he was around. When I told her this, her anger quickly morphed into concern. She promised that this would not continue. If he came in on my next shift, she would tell him in no uncertain terms that he was to purchase his items and then leave the store. Any interaction with staff should be restricted to questions about the merchandise, and she kept her word. The next day that I worked, Jeff entered the store and made a beeline for me at the counter, but my manager interposed herself between us. She then proceeded to lay down the law to Jeff. I expected him to argue, but instead he clenched his fists and jaw tightly, nodding as she spoke, veins bulging in his bright red face. Then he turned on his heels and stomped. As he disappeared from view, a wave of relief washed over me. Over the past several months, I had grown increasingly anxious whenever I worked. I watched the doors nervously, knowing that Jeff would appear but never knowing when. I felt powerless, listening to his precursory delusions day after day. I never realized how strongly I dreaded him, until that dread was washed away, and I felt as if I could breathe again. For several weeks, everything was perfectly blissfully normal. Then one Saturday, the phone started calling. I was at the counter when it rang. Happily, I snatched the phone off the cradle and chirped my cheeriest, "Hello, this is Hot Topic. How can I help?" It was Jeff. He said sarcastically, "Since I'm only allowed to talk to you about the merchandise, what sort of pants do you have?" This arse made me give him a verbal description of every single style of pant on the sales floor before he ended the conversation, and all that dread came surging back, hitting me like a Mack truck. The phone calls died out quickly. I guess they just weren't doing it for him. Once again, I made the mistake of exhaling. Christmas was approaching, and I, cheered by my new Jeffless existence, decided to do my Christmas shopping at the mall before my shift. As I shopped, I noticed that someone began appearing at nearly every store I visited, and it wasn't Santa Claus. Of course, it was Jeff, materializing from the ether like a greasy spectre. First, I caught a glimpse of him from the corner of my eye at the gourmet popcorn shop. Then he was behind me at FYE. Next, I bumped into him in Nordstrom. I knew this was no coincidence. Jeff was following me, and I panicked. The whole experience was surreal, as if I was watching another woman's life. Robotically, I went into the food court for a gigantic Diet Coke, but Jeff was behind me again in short order. I made it clear that I saw him. He smiled and waved, but I didn't reciprocate. Instead, I turned around to face the counter. After a few minutes, I felt a tap on my shoulder. Suddenly, I was no longer frightened nor exhausted. I was pissed about the fact that this sticky man-child had hijacked my emotional well-being, and for what? I whirled around, demanding, "What do you want, Jeff?" Jeff was taken aback. "I haven't seen you in a while. I just wanted to say hi," he answered, as if my question had wounded him. "Bull, you're following me. I saw you at FYE. I saw you at Nordstrom. You've been following me through the mall." "Whoa, you're paranoid," he retorted, with just a touch of condescension in his voice. "Maybe, but I don't want you coming to where I work anymore when I'm there. I don't want you calling me at work. I don't want you tapping on my shoulder to say hi. I want you to leave me alone." And by the time I'd finished the sentence, I was shaking with rage. I didn't give him a chance to reply. I walked out of the line and headed for work. After the confrontation in line, I felt powerful for the first time in months. I wasn't sure that Jeff was gone, but I believed that I could handle things if he wasn't. Christmas and New Year came and went. I had put Jeff out of my mind. One night I was closing shift on Saturday. Saturdays are busy as hell in the mall, so the parking lot was usually full when I arrived. To avoid a long walk to the door, I parked around the back in one of the few scattered employee spaces. I exited the mall as I usually would, and then headed towards my car. In hindsight, I recognize how incredibly dangerous these lots were. The lighting was sparse and non-existent, and the spaces were relatively isolated. Unless someone happened to exit from a rear door, no one would even see a crime take place. Unlike the customer lot, which is in full view of the street. But I was dead to the danger that I was in until I heard a familiar voice behind me. "Hey." It was Jeff. For the first time, I appreciated how truly vulnerable I was. My mind began running disaster simulations. If he ran at me or tried to grab me, could I make it to my car? Probably not, my mind pronounced. Jeff seemed out of shape, but I was wearing impractical footwear which would inevitably slow me down. If I chose to scream, would anyone hear me? Maybe. Slowly, I turned around to face him. "Hey," I said flatly, trying my best to conceal fear. Then, much to my horror, he asked if I needed a ride. He was smiling a strange, cruel smile, and my stomach dropped. I was convinced that Jeff had done something to my car, like slashed the tires or something, perhaps the windshield. I asked him why he would ask me that, while I was on my way to my own vehicle. He didn't answer me. So I turned around and continued to my car, walking as quickly as I could manage. He caught up to me with ease. He then proceeded to tell me that I was horrible for speaking to him the way I had, and that he had every right to visit any store he wished. He had more to say, but I couldn't seem to process his words. I was in full flight mode, and my brain was screaming that I urgently needed to get into my car. I reached the door, but struggled to unlock it because my hands were shaking. Jeff was still sprouting just over my shoulder. My battle with the key seemed to stretch on for eons. I probably fumbled only for a moment though. And I heard the comforting pop of the lock, and I quickly yanked the door open and slid inside, pulling the door shut after me. Outside the driver's side window, in the dim light, I could see Jeff's face. His expression seemed to be a melange of hurt and rage. What happened next seemed to occur in slow motion. Jeff was reaching for my door handle. Reflexively, I slammed the lock button with just seconds to spare. I genuinely have no idea what would have happened had my reflexes been a tad slower that night. I sped away high on adrenaline. I never saw Jeff at the mall again, but I constantly feared another encounter. Once your illusion of safety is shattered, it's difficult to repair. I know that Jeff lived in town since he had attended my high school. I feared that he knew where I lived. The next escalation could be to my very home. He now knew the make and model of my car, assuming he didn't before, and the car would be easy enough to find if anyone were determined to do so. Fortunately, none of these nightmare scenarios came to be. Years later, I received a friend request from Jeff. I accepted, not sure why. Some part of me was still afraid to anger him. Another part thought it might be safer keeping tabs on him. And another part of me wanted to prove that I was no longer the scared girl I had been. Almost immediately, Jeff messaged me. Much like the first encounter in Hot Topic, the contents of the message were fairly benign. How are you? How have you been? That sort of thing. I offered him monosyllabic responses, hoping to discourage further contact. As before, it quickly escalated. I received long paragraphs about a girl who broke his heart, and reminiscing about me. He told me that he used to watch my friend and I outside on the lawn at her house having oh-so-goth picnics under an umbrella in the rain. Suddenly I realized why Jeff had initially seemed so familiar to me. He and my friend rode the same bus, and I often accompanied her home. Jeff had been on the bus. I vaguely recalled him knocking on her door one day with a bag of Cheetos or some such snackable nonsense. I felt violated, knowing that I had been surreptitiously watched, and these were simply the moments that he admitted to observing. I had no idea if there were other occasions that he didn't wax nostalgia about. I couldn't quite process that. Who spies on someone and then reminisces with them about how they'd spied on them? Did he think it was cute? Did he think I would find it cute? I left Jeff to read, but took screenshots of the messages. And I woke up the next morning with a glut of messages, most which were sent in the wee hours of the morning. He told me that he would not be ignored, disrespected, or pushed away. He rhetorically asked why I thought I could get away with this, and he sent me a link about ghosting and narcissism, obviously insinuating that because I hadn't responded to this revelation that he had been spying on me, that I was therefore ghosting him, and consequently a narcissist. He said that he was so depressed and lonely that he contemplated suicide on a daily basis, and all he wanted was a friend. I wasted no time in screenshotting his messages, reporting him and blocking him. I told this story to a group of friends one night. This made me curious about the ultimate fate of Jeff. I reached out to a friend who remained plugged into hometown gossip and learned that Jeff had been arrested for domestic violence and sexual assault against his 17-year-old girlfriend. I couldn't help but shudder at what might have happened if I didn't slap that lock button so quickly that night in the parking lot. To those of you out there who might be struggling with Jeffs of their own, 1, you should know that it isn't mean or judgmental to trust your gut. If I had cut Jeff off on that fateful day in Hot Topic, things may not have escalated. 2, don't hesitate to reach out for help. And 3, as powerful as it may feel to confront demons from your past, don't risk further victimization. Abusive stalkers seldom change. And to Jeff, wherever you are, let's never meet again. Hey guys, it's Mort here and thank you so much for listening. I do hope that you enjoyed tonight's stories as always. It was certainly fun, reading some Let's Not Meet type stories. They really had me hooked. I didn't realize that I'd been recording for an hour at this point. Again, sorry to keep harping on about it, but to anyone who wants to contribute to the project, it really does mean a lot to me to get this app off the ground. It's, we've worked really hard on it, and I really, really just would like as many people to enjoy it as possible and just to have it out there sooner. So, please have a look, have a think. Alright then, I'd like to extend a huge thank you as well to all my members, patrons, coffee supporters. You guys are amazing. I really value you more than you know. And with Halloween coming up soon, I of course have our annual 100 ghost stories nearly ready. I'm just trying to procure the last few stories that we need. Leonora also didn't want to sleep her nap, so she was strapped to my chest because that sort of forces her to nap this whole video while I was on my knees. And I am really sweaty. It's hard to record these videos sometimes, but it makes me happy that you guys like them. Alright then, let's wrap things up here for tonight. I'll see you on Friday. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.